Steen joined Genfit as CSO in 2000. He's been coordinating the company's R&D efforts in its race to be the first to market in NASH. NASH is an inflammation of the liver, and the market for a treatment, of which there is none yet, clocks in at about 37 billion euro, if I got that correct. So Genfit may be the first company to actually bring one of those treatments to market and take a bite out of it with its lead candidate, Elafibranor, which is currently in phase 3 in the clinic. But to start off, could you elaborate further on the clinical need that Genfit is addressing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Evelyn. I just want to point out a few things. Today, there are many different programs, many different companies, which is in the NASH space. But when we decided to go into NASH way back in 2012. Okay, and you're right, today there are basically two leading companies in the NASH space. That's Genfit with Elafibranor, Intercept with obeticholic acid, okay, and both of these programs are in phase 3. So I think a lot has been said about, first to market and all that. I think it's important to remember that the prevalence of NASH, it's high prevalence, okay? If you think about, how many NASH patients are out there, there are many studies which has been completed, and that number of prevalence varies quite a bit, but I think one of the best studies which has been done and completed to look at prevalence is one done in the States, a study coming out of Texas, and that study shows a prevalence of up to 12% of the adult U.S. population has NASH. Okay, so that means a huge market. Okay, NASH is a multifactorial disease, quite complex. So the point I'm going to get to is that with such a market size, there's going to be room for more than these two drugs, which will make it to the market at about the same time. Okay, and there's going to be room for multiple approaches and so on. So I think the point is not so much who's going to make it to the market first. And in such a situation, I think the first mover advantage is quite limited. I think what's going to be important is to think about what are the profiles of the different drugs when they get to the market. And you got to think about, of course, efficacy and safety and so on. And I think this is where Elafibranor has very clear differentiations with some of the different drug candidates which are going through the pipeline. And I think that's the important point, the differentiation, safety, efficacy, tolerability, and so on.
In there are so many questions that I want to come back to, but so what's the current treatment paradigm for how is NASH currently addressed, and what is the disease progression that has to be addressed?
Okay, so today there is no approved drug. Okay, so right now, nothing is out there on the market, and which, of course, makes this quite a critical stage. Both the FDA as well as the EMA has put NASH as a high priority, okay? And you have groups like the Liver Forum and so on who are involved, and the objective of the Liver Forum is really to find a critical path forward to get drug on the market as efficiently as possible in an optimal way, and really to provide drugs to be able to address these patients, okay? So NASH, and we're not talking about isolated steatosis or isolated fat in the liver. We're talking about NASH, where you have fat inflammation as well as damaged hepatocytes in the liver. When you have these things, then you have NASH. So this is a severe disease, and what you want to do is treat these NASH patients and prevent them from progressing to clinical events. So clinical events includes things like cirrhosis, as well as overall mortality, as well as cardiovascular events. Okay, I think it's important because NASH patients are by and large cardiometabolic disease patients, and so the leading cause of mortality in NASH patients is actually cardiovascular events and cardiovascular disease, and not so much liver events. Okay, so the treatment paradigm right now, there are some compounds or drugs which has been tested, things like vitamin E and so on. It's used sparingly, but what is clear is that there is this very large unmet need. And what is nice right now is that the NASH field has come to a stage where different things are coming together. You have the regulatory agencies which are on board, okay, providing a regulatory path forward, recognizing that this is a severe disease, making it a high priority on their list. You have different drug companies working on different approaches, and now the drug development pipeline has come to a certain level of maturity. And also, I think there's increasing disease awareness. Although I think we all have to continue working on increasing disease awareness, there is more disease awareness right now. So all these things are coming together. So your question about treatment paradigm, I think another important aspect is, of course, is lifestyle management, exercising more, eating properly, and so on. I think this is sort of like the baseline counseling that everyone should take into account, but we all know that that's not going to be enough the way it is for many metabolic diseases.
I see. But with regards to the progressive disease aspect, it doesn't sound like it's, well, it's not unlike Alzheimer's. And if prevention, like you mentioned with lifestyle, is probably the most, or arguably the most effective, how do you design a clinical trial for a preventative treatment?
I wouldn't say lifestyle is the most appropriate treatment. I think it's like many, if not all, metabolic diseases, having an improved lifestyle is something that's important. I think it's something that should be counseled sort of like as first-line recommendations for all the patients, okay? But we all know that when you think about metabolic diseases, things like type 2 diabetes as well as obesity, we all know that these diseases, if you lose weight, if you eat properly, if you exercise more, this will be beneficial for these diseases. But at the same time, we know that this is not realistic. I think, unfortunately, there's a small percentage of patients who are able to maintain that improvement in lifestyle, and NASH is not going to be any different. I mean, I heard one of the experts talk about that aspect recently, and he was talking about how often do he see his patients that he can counsel this lifestyle change. He says, if I see my patients 4 times a year, which is already pretty good, he says, that means I have FaceTime with this patient less than 1/100th of 1%. Okay, so then which means, it's not a realistic way to go after these patients. So more precisely to your question, Evelyn, how do you design a clinical trial? So really, what you want to do is to target the population of NASH patients who are at the highest risk to progress the clinical events. So clinical events includes overall mortality, cirrhosis, cardiovascular events, and so on. Okay, so you want to target these patients who are at highest risk to progress. So right now, the regulatory pathway is that you want to include these more severe patients into a trial. Okay, you want to hit on a primary endpoint showing that you're able to have a positive impact or significant impact on the histology of their liver, because this is how NASH is defined today, histologically. We can talk about that later on if you like. And if you hit on that endpoint, you'll get registration, you'll get marketing approval, but then you have to continue your trial to hit on a fixed number of clinical events. Because what you want to show is that if you're able to demonstrate this histological endpoint, hitting this histological endpoint, you want to show that that translates to clinical benefit, meaning fewer clinical events. So there is that clinical regulatory path forward, okay, so that's pretty clear and straightforward. And so this is how you do the phase 3s to get drugs on the market.
So which, or to be clear, like which part of NASH is Genfit specifically targeting? And you're trying to reverse the histological effects, correct?
Yeah, that's another great question. So these are things which are discussed amongst experts. These are things which are discussed in the liver forum and so on. So I think what's important that we all realize is that, this disease, usually the patients, when they have metabolic diseases, the first signs is you would have isolated fat in your liver, okay? And that's fairly benign from a clinical standpoint. But then when you then accumulate inflammatory foci, and then if you have hepatocyte cell damage in your cells, when you have these 3 things, okay, then you have NASH, okay? And that's how it's defined. So when you have NASH, then you're at really high risk to have the onset of liver fibrosis and progressive fibrosis. So it's really the NASH which is driving these patients into liver fibrosis, okay? And then that fibrosis can progress into cirrhosis, liver damage, and so on. So if you think about this natural history of NASH, there are different ways to look at it. I would think, and this is how what we have shown with Elafibranor, is that it can treat the underlying cause of the fibrosis, meaning it is able to resolve the NASH without the worsening of fibrosis. So the treatment paradigm there is that if you can treat the underlying cause of the liver fibrosis, then over time, the fibrosis in the liver should be able to stop progressing, and it should regress over time because you've taken away the stress which drives the fibrosis. And the reason this will happen is because the liver is one of those rare organs that can regenerate, and the liver also has fibrolytic mechanisms within that organ, so the fibrosis will regress. So if you think about it, it's really not that different than treating HCV, for example. Okay, HCV patients, it's a viral hepatitis, and the virus, this drives the patients into liver fibrosis and cirrhosis as well. The way you treat HCV is with an antiviral. So the way you should treat NASH is with an anti-NASH. Okay, I mean, right now, you don't see people treating HCV directly, at least not as a first-line treatment with an antiviral. So NASH is not that different. So Elafibranor has, to your question, how does Elafibranor work? What we have been able to demonstrate in our phase 2b trial, that was a 1-year trial, and yes, we looked at the biopsy, okay, and we were able to show that it's able to resolve NASH without the worsening of fibrosis, and it's understood that, and we have data from our phase 2b showing is that if you're able to resolve the NASH of these patients, then we also see a fibrosis benefit when you look at these patients who are able to resolve their NASH versus those patients who are not able to resolve. So when you think about this natural history and progression of the disease, of course, the other aspect is there are different programs out there which is targeting the fibrosis directly. Okay, so I think there's a lot of arguments which can be made for that as well. So let's hope, that an anti-fibrotic approach would work. You would expect the fibrosis to stop progressing, but then you have to realize the underlying cause of the fibrosis, the NASH, is still there. Okay, so the liver will still have a lot of fat in it. It'll have inflammation. It'll still have these damaged hepatocytes. So I would think that if you go in there with an anti-fibrotic drug only, you're going to have to combine that with an anti-NASH. Okay, so I would then argue that if you have an anti-NASH approach like Elafibranor, you can probably treat a very wide patient population with NASH.
I see. So I just want to take the last minute to then sort of look at NASH as a whole and ask about the companies that you think would help cover the patients that you're not able to with Elafibranor. And in that, I was hoping that you could comment on the rather zealous buying spree of Allergan in the last year or so. So what other companies and which other drugs do you think will be similarly helpful or as helpful?
Okay, great question. At the beginning of your question, you mentioned that, how are we going to address, how should the field address patients which are not covered by Elafibranor? I think it's important we keep in mind that if you look at the mechanism of action of Elafibranor, I think Elafibranor should work in a very wide NASH population. Okay, because it's able to resolve NASH, you can use it to treat the earlier patients, but you can also use it to treat the later patients with advanced fibrosis. Okay, you will have that. You should be able to have that efficacy to resolve NASH without the worsening fibrosis. I mentioned the profile of Elafibranor at the very beginning. I think it's important to point out that what we have shown with our phase 2b data, okay, this is the 1-year NASH trial, is that Elafibranor is able to resolve NASH, but it also has a cardiometabolic benefit, and that is because it's working through PPAR alpha and PPAR delta. We have no PPAR gamma activity, which is important for side effect issues, but it is a dual agonist working on both PPAR alpha and PPAR delta. And what we have been able to show is that you do have this cardiometabolic benefit. So remember, the leading cause of mortality in NASH patients is cardiovascular events. Okay, so today, if you look at the whole competitive landscape in NASH, Elafibranor is the only drug candidate which has been able to demonstrate the resolution of NASH combined with this cardiometabolic benefit. So I think this is a very important differentiation between elafibranor and anything else which is on the pipeline right now, okay? So, and I'll just have to repeat again that if you're able to resolve NASH, then you'll have a positive impact on the fibrosis. So in our phase 3, we have a key secondary endpoint, which is looking at improvement in fibrosis, okay? So I think, that's an important aspect because we fully expect that elafibranor, when it's able to resolve NASH, we should get a fibrosis benefit. Now, having said that, I think, NASH is quite a heterogeneous disease, okay? It is multifactorial, and like many metabolic diseases, chances are you'll have to combine different types of therapies. This is the way type 2 diabetes is treated, this is the way hypertension is treated, and so on, okay? So chances are you'll need combination therapy. Now, again, if you think about the profile of elafibranor, it works to resolve NASH, cardiometabolic benefit, and it's a very safe compound, no toxicity issues, no tolerability issues, okay? So I think elafibranor, it's a very strong candidate to be first-line treatment as a standalone monotherapy, but I think it also serves as a very strong candidate which can serve as foundation for combination therapy, okay? So this combination approach, this is something we have been working on, and I think there are many different companies working and looking at different combinations. And what we have been doing is to looking at different types of combinations, looking at drugs in the market, drugs in the NASH competitive landscape, looking at proprietary compounds, which we have within Genfit. And what we have been able to show is elafibranor can make good combinations with different types of drugs out there. So what we're really looking for is complementarity of mechanisms of action with elafibranor and other drugs which are out there. So right now, sorry, go ahead.
I think I have to stop you so that we can take questions from the audience, but, or you can keep going. Does anyone have questions? No. Well, but, well, I'd like to pin you down on the specifics of which other companies and like which other drugs, and why is there so much M&A activity, and why is it Allergan that's perpetuating all of it?
Well, yeah, again, if we come back to, what NASH is, the prevalence of NASH, I think companies like Genfit and Intercept have provided clinical proof of concept that you can target this disease, okay? The regulatory landscape is such that there is path forward now, which is quite clear. And all these things taken together, I think, which is part of the reason why larger groups have now very large interest in NASH. So it's not only Allergan, you have Gilead, you have quite a few now major pharmaceutical groups, starting their NASH programs. And if you think about it, some of these companies are building pipelines on NASH, having a portfolio on NASH, and I think they're taking different approaches, not only focusing on fibrosis, although some companies are only focusing on fibrosis. If you think about Gilead, it's clear that they have acquired earlier stage programs, okay, which can address NASH at different stages, both the metabolic part, the fibrotic part, and so on. So I think what's important is that you really have to think about the comprehensive clinical management of NASH patients, okay? And this is what Genfit is doing. We're not only focusing on the therapy with elafibranor as well, we're looking also at the fibrotic aspect of NASH patients. You probably know we have an independent program looking at fibrosis. We have a drug candidate to look at fibrosis. But then the other important aspect is when you think about the comprehensive management of NASH patients, you have to think about diagnostics. Today, you have to take a liver biopsy. So if you think about the large number of patients out there, I think it's unrealistic to think that you can address the majority of these patients if you have to rely on a liver biopsy to diagnose them. So we at Genfit are working on developing an in vitro diagnostic test based on a blood sample, which is going to be non-invasive. And we're also building and looking at disease awareness, both for addressing the patients, their families, as well as other physicians beyond hepatologists. So we have formed this foundation called the NEP, which is the NASH Education Program, and this is something initiated by Genfit, and this is led by Jean-Christophe Mark, who's here with me today. So there really is to build disease awareness at different levels, which I think is going to be really important for the sake of the patients.
Okay, well, yeah, that is really important, and there are quite a number of patients. So, all right, that's all we really have time for. If anyone has questions that they thought of in the last minute or two, then you can find Dean afterwards or at lunch, I guess. I think that's what it's time for, right, Tom?
Exactly. I think everyone is hungry as well, as hungry as I am, potentially. I have to stay away from that speaker. Thanks a lot, Dean. Round of applause for Dean.